So what happens when you add a steel rim to a frisbee? G'day everyone, my name's Oscar Felberg and today I'm going to be going over this disc golf experiment that I've been working on for a really long time and I haven't really finished it, but I just want to get a video out there on it. So in this video I'm just going to go over the experiment, present what I've done so far and see what you think. So I'm probably 70% of the way through this experiment. I haven't been able to really draw any conclusive results as of yet, but what I have found has been interesting and not exactly what I expected. So right now I'm going to go over the reasoning for the experiment, the science behind it, and how I've been going about it. If you just want to see a steel rim disc flying, jump ahead in the video and I'll see you there. So I'm calling this experiment the effects of increasing the moment of inertia of a flying disc, or does rim weight matter? The first thing to get out of the way is that the science of a flying disc is probably more complicated than you think. It's still a contentious topic to this day and people argue online about it all the time. So basically I have to put a caveat on this video. I'm not an expert. I might get some things wrong. That's okay. I'm okay with that. The sources for my information are in the description, so you can sort of check that out there. So I've also taken more of a Mythbusters approach to this experiment, which basically just means I've done what I think is really interesting and cool over a more rigorous, accurate, and ultimately arduous process. So if you are an expert on this topic, I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on this and maybe even be able to work with you on making this a much more comprehensive experiment. So let's talk about the science behind this experiment and why I'm doing it. Increasing the percentage of a disc's weight that is located further from the center of a disc will increase its moment of inertia. Now, moment of inertia is basically an object's property of how easy or hard it is to spin. So if we think about the classic example of an ice skater spinning on ice, if they put their hands out, they're really hard to spin. And if you tuck your hands in, it's really easy to spin. So same rule applies to a disc as it's spinning. So because a disc is spinning in flight, if we increase its moment of inertia, we also increase its angular momentum, provided it stays spinning at the same RPM. Angular momentum is the product of an object's moment of inertia times by its angular velocity or its RPM. More angular momentum will mean a more gyroscopically stable disc, which in terms of disc golf will mean a disc that resists pitching movements, which we know as turn and fade. Overall, creating a net straighter flying disc. That's the theory anyway, and really what I want to test out in this whole experiment. So disc manufacturers have already used this knowledge to create overmold discs, which have a heavier TPU on the rim and a lighter plastic on the flight plate. However, the TPU is really only slightly more dense than the inner plastic, really only creating a 5% increase in moment of inertia at its best. That's if they use the heaviest TPU they can and the lightest plastic that they can. So what I want to know is what happens when we take this concept to the absolute extreme by making the rim super heavy and the flight plate super light. So it's pretty funny, this morning when I was doing a little more research for this video, I came across this science fair experiment from 2006 at the Californian State Science Fair. Michael A. Reynes did an experiment on frisbee flight characteristics, and in his conclusion he says, using both research and data, a new, more effective frisbee design can be produced. It involves a lightweight frisbee with a heavy metal ring in its inner rim. This would direct all the force of a launch or throw to the frisbee's angular momentum, making it go farther. So with that in mind, that's basically the aim of my experiment here, is to make a 150 to 175 gram golf disc with as much of that weight located on the rim as possible. I'm calling these discs max-moy discs, short for maximum moment of inertia. I'll then compare these max-moy discs to standard discs and compare the flight characteristics and see what happens. So when designing the discs, I chose 9-speed drivers as the platform for this experiment. Why? Well, 9-speed drivers, often known as control drivers, have this excellent balance between control and distance. They're easy to throw consistently, but they also go a long way. Consistency is great for this kind of test, and a long flight should give us enough time to sort of notice any differences in flight. I didn't choose putters or mid-ranges because they're already fairly straight flying discs and it might be hard to see any difference. And I didn't go with high-speed drivers because they're hard to throw consistently. The discs that I've designed are based on the key dimensions of an In of a Thunderbird, which is one of the most popular 9-speed discs out there, and it's also a fairly neutral flying disc. So how did I make these discs? Well, firstly, I had a mate of mine, Chris DeGroot. He's a fairly skilled steel fabricator. He made me some steel rims out of 5mm steel rod that he ring rolled together and then welded in place around a jig so that they are exactly the right size at roughly 200mm in diameter, and he's ground back the weld for me as well. Big thanks to Chris for these. These weigh almost exactly 100 grams, which accounts for 57 to 67% of the overall disc's weight. That'll be entirely located in the rim. For the flight plate, I CNC machined the disc profile out of a lightweight material with a little lip in it for the steel rim to seat into. This was done on an Australian-made hobby-style CNC router called Blue Carve. My first attempts at this were with high-density blue foam. It's super lightweight and machines really well. So this is the Mark 1 Max-Moy disc, and it weighs a total of 117 grams, which is pretty absurd really. And even with it being so light, it still has a 13% increase in moment of inertia over a standard 175 gram disc. So I've ended up reinforcing this disc with masking tape, which isn't ideal, but it did do a good job at strengthening it. I don't like it because it sort of adds random areas of weight that I couldn't control, and also the little bits of tape that are sort of sticking up in areas aerodynamically affect the disc much in the same way that chips and dings from standard discs hitting trees and stuff usually make discs more understable. I expect sort of the same thing happened with this disc. Wasn't too happy with it. But it was the first attempt, and I got a few throws in with it to see sort of if I was going down the right direction. The next attempt eventuated in the Mark II Max-Moy disc, for which I coated the whole thing in a layer of polyurethane, which worked okay. I was hoping that the polyurethane coating would strengthen the disc, glue the steel rim in place, add a more plasticky feel, as well as make it so I could dial in the weight of the disc a bit better. The polyurethane just wasn't quite the right stuff in the end though. It's too soft, too grippy. Honestly, it feels gross. It's overly tacky and just not nice. But mostly it just wasn't strong enough either. Your fingers would basically tear through the coating when you throw it. Not great. The coating also, because I couldn't get it evenly coated, changed the profile of the rim up randomly and made it kind of convex, which again aerodynamically just isn't ideal. The disc did weigh a nicer 151 grams and had a 32% larger moment of inertia over a standard 175 gram disc. So at this point I realized that I needed to look for a different flight plate material as the foam just wasn't working. And so I began looking for a lightweight wood material. Balsa, I just felt like it was going to be too weak and a little too light even. A wood called Gyroscopic seemed perfect for it, but it's a little harder to source. So I ended up just going with regular old radiata pine. The steel rim just press fits into the lip really solidly, no glue needed. The disc is super strong, really stiff. It weighs 180 grams, which is 5 grams over my target. A little bit annoying, but not overly bad. Honestly, it feels like it weighs about 250 grams. Just something about the stiffness and the weight distribution just makes this disc feel so heavy. And the stiffness and just wood texture means it doesn't feel like a regular plastic frisbee, but the grip is okay. And the Mark III has a solid 48% greater moment of inertia when compared to a standard 175 gram disc. So how do they fly? Well, the Mark I and Mark II discs didn't get many throws each before they were kind of too broken to continue with. They both flew with a moderate amount of turn and a pretty consistent fade as well. I would compare these discs to sort of an Inver Valkyrie or maybe even an MVP Inertia, discs that sort of have that understability but the consistent fade. It was, however, hard to throw either of these discs with much more than 60 to 70% power because it just felt like they were going to break in your hands. The last throw that the Mark II had was at the hands of Paddy Robinson, and he absolutely teared a chunk out of the rim during that throw. It was a really nice hyzer flip to turnover. It went about 100 meters, but it was the last throw this disc had. I'm really sorry that the footage of the throws with these discs is terrible. It's from late 2018, I think, and my camera was pretty bugged at that point. So let's look at the flight of the Mark III, which was actually made middle of last year, but it's still going strong. So when I went out to the field to test the Max Moy discs, I was always throwing against a bunch of other 9-speed discs of different stabilities to see sort of what it compared to. These throws you're going to see are comparing it against a G-Star Thunderbird and a Goldline Saint Pro, both 175 grams. And I'm showing you those clips because this disc really did compare most easily to the Thunderbird and the Saint Pro, which have very similar dimensions. So the first round of throws, I was just sort of throwing slight hyzers and I had a slight tailwind. Each set of throws, I'll throw the Saint Pro, then the Thunderbird, and then the Mark III Max Moy. So I got that one a little bit higher, and you can see it faded out a little bit more. Now I'm doing sort of the same throw, but coming back into a headwind. We can see both the Saint Pro and the Thunderbird flipped up from the slight hyzer, rode straight, and then faded out. The Max Moy I got a little flatter, so it actually got a little turn to it, but again, it came back at the end with a little fade. This one I was sort of trying to throw a max distance line, getting them discs nice and flat and letting them have a full flight. Both the Saint Pro and the Thunderbird fairly straight flights overall, as you'd expect. The Max Moy I cranked on a little bit more, put a touch of Annie on it, and it full flexed. You can see it come back at the end there. Then I threw a few forehands, only the Thunderbird worked out well. From the two standard discs, you can see a little hyzer flip, turnover and fade. And then again, just got over a little bit on the Max Moy disc, but again, it flexed and faded. Now a really interesting one was throwing with a lot of anhyzer and seeing how they would fight out of that or whether they would hold the line. The Thunderbird here, you can see holds the line and pans to flat. The Max Moy, same line, just a little bit lower, but again, just pans straight to flat, and yeah. I then wanted to see if it was possible to throw a roller with these discs. So this is the Saint Pro, turned into a bit of a cut roller. Didn't work out. This is just to see if they can be thrown sort of, or how unstable they can be thrown. The Thunderbird, I got it down on a right angle, was going really good, hit a branch. And then the Max Moy, I just really couldn't get the power or the angle into it, and it ended up being this crazy cut roller that just went super far left. And these are just some other throws by friends of mine, just to show you the variations of different throws. Oh, a bit of an early release. So the last thing I did was use slow motion footage to capture the RPM of the standard disc and compare that to the Max Moy discs. And what I found was standard discs had an average RPM for me of 1062 RPMs, and the average throw for the Max Moy disc was 1059 RPMs, so only a difference of 3 RPMs, very minimal. So yeah, the Mark III is just a fairly neutral, stable disc. Doesn't really go that far, which might be due to the 180 grams. Flat throws in no wind kind of just go straight for 50 to 60% of the flight, and then it starts to fade out, but not any crazy overstable fade. It's definitely not understable or anything either, just again very neutral. Didn't really hold the line quite as well as the other discs I was throwing, but again that could just be the 180 grams talking. I'd say it flies similar to a max weight, stable, flat top Thunderbird. So my thoughts so far. Going into this experiment, I didn't expect these discs to be the laser beam straight discs that the theory suggests. I had hoped they would be, but I didn't expect them to be that. But I also didn't expect them to be just so similar to regular standard discs either. I thought, if anything, maybe they'll be crazy overstable, maybe crazy understable, maybe we'd get some weird S-curve patterns. I just didn't expect them to be that similar to a regular disc. Because I mean, we've changed a lot about these discs. This is crazy stiff. The weight distribution is really different. There's just so much. The aerodynamic profile is different. It's just not the same as a regular frisbee, so it's really weird to me that it flies so similar. So why is this? Again, this is where I say I'm not an expert. There is a solid train of thought that states that a disc only needs enough spin so that it's a stable wing in flight. So as long as the disc is released with some spin and is thrown smoothly without wobble, it should fly very similar regardless of the RPM it's thrown at. Release velocity, nose angle, trajectory, and a clean release are much more important factors in determining how a disc flies. So this doesn't actually disprove the theory that we're testing here. It just states that discs are already so light that the increased gyroscopic stability from increasing spin or increasing the moment of inertia doesn't really impact how a disc flies because it's already so light. So I've shown that I can throw the Mark III Max Moy disc at roughly the same RPMs as a standard disc, and that should see a 48% increase in the disc's angular momentum, yet we're not seeing any difference in flight characteristics. Maybe it's because gyroscopic stability really doesn't have that much effect on a flying disc. I'd still like to do more testing before I come to any firm conclusion, but it is interesting. So where to from here? Well, I'd like to keep making some of these discs because it's fun and pretty interesting. I've designed a bunch of different flight plates for the steel rims that have different profiles and geometries, and I'd like to test whether the differences I've designed into them have the impact in flight that I would expect. I'd also like to make a disc solely out of the pine, designed in a really similar shape to the Mark III disc, and test to see whether that flies the same. It should weigh about 90 grams, so half the weight. Will it fly the same though? And then on the opposite scale of things, I'd also like to make a disc with a steel weight located entirely in the center, which might be really hard to do, but who knows what that will fly like. I've definitely heard people say online putters and mids fly the straightest because they have more of their weight towards the center, thus they can spin faster. I don't know if that theory is looking so strong right now, but we'll see. I'd also just like to continue to test and collect data on these discs, get more people to try them out and see what they think. And I'd also like to collect better data on release RPM and release velocity of the different discs to get a better understanding of that. So thank you so much for watching this video. It might have been really long and there might have been too much science, or maybe not enough for some of you. But if you've made it this far, thank you so much. Definitely click like, and if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, do that. We're going to be coming out with more Australian disc golf content. Thanks guys.